So English literary periods. I'm going to go through this quickly. So when we uh, start to study a work, we need to ask ourselves, first off, I think, when was the work written? And this helps us to understand the dominant literary cultural movements at the time, the context of the work. So it helps us to understand where work is situates in the history of ideas, in terms of the socio-political context. Um, if the literary author wants us to understand the world in a new way, it helps us to understand that against which the author is reacting. However, there are limits to periodization. Okay, so the periods that we're about to talk through, they a work cannot be reduced to its historical context. Um, in some forms of Marxism, uh, what's called reflection theory, uh, literary works, all works, were seen as merely reflections of their material conditions, their socioeconomic context. So if you lived in a Middle Ages with a feudal mode of production, then you would have certain ideas and literary forms produced just de facto. And those were just epiphenomena of those material conditions. That is reductive, to my mind and that of most scholars. Um, the other thing I would point out with the periods is that the borderlines between them are not airtight, to say the least. Okay, so when we're about to go through the periods that are roughly most often attributed to these different literary periods, but they're largely fictional. They're added by later scholars to the past, and it's not as though we're going to talk about the Renaissance starting in 1485. It's not as though authors all of a sudden woke up in 1485 and say, okay, it's the Renaissance now. I have to start writing differently, right? So, what are we looking at in this slide? So, in this slide, we're seeing, um, starting with the left, kind of pre-English roots, ancient literary works of the classical tradition. So, Homer, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, all the literary authors of the Greek tradition, but also later of the Latin tradition, uh, under the Roman Republic, then Empire, Virgil, other authors, Seneca, I haven't listed here, but that tradition. So that's the most influential tradition for English literature. Um, then starting with the next column, we have medieval literature, and this covers a huge span of time, 1,000 years, from around 450 to 1485. We have works such as Beowulf, authors such as Chaucer in that huge period. And then uh, we have the Renaissance, as I mentioned, around 1485 to 1660, authors such as Spenser, Shakespeare, Milton. Now, I have detailed videos that are intros to almost all of these periods. So I have an intro to medieval literature, to Renaissance literature, Romanticism, Modernism. Um, I won't go through the four on the next four columns, but you understand, you can look through and understand those yourself. Restoration, 18th century, Romanticism, Victorian literature, um, 20th century and beyond. That's a catch-all. That's the Norton Anthology of English Literature uses. But within there, most predominantly modernism and postmodernism. Now, I've color coded these because at the University of Ottawa, if you're an English major, you're going to be asked to take two courses. One course is English 2105, is British literature up to 1700. That covers those first two categories, medieval and Renaissance. And then you would take English 2106, British literature from 1700 to the present. Also listed along the bottom, the history of ideas. Again, understanding the context. What ideas are they responding to? That's an important part of understanding the period. I also have introduction videos to each of those periods, as well as kind of these three waves of modernity generally. Because the medieval period, especially, but also the Renaissance, cover uh, large, large temporal periods, it's profitable to understand a bit how they can be broken down a bit more precisely. So in the medieval period, you can have the Anglo-Saxon sub-period, Anglo-Norman, Middle English, etc. Uh, Under the Renaissance, I'll just point out that Elizabethan and Jacobean ages, so they refer to the monarchs at the time, right? So Elizabeth the First was monarch in that period, and then James in that second period. So Shakespeare, this one Shakespeare's writing. Shakespeare's writing, Spencer's writing, Sidney's writing, Marlowe, these others. So we have this rise in lyrics, so love sonnets. We have the rise of drama, so true tragedy for the first time in thousands of years, right? And so this is often referred to as the golden age of English literature. It's the period of literature that I specialized in. So what are the beginnings of English literature? So the the island of Britain was colonized by the Romans in the 400s, but they gradually had to abandon that, or up to the 400s. They gradually had to abandon this because of other pressures in the empire. And as they did so, beginning in the mid 5th century, various Germanic tribes, as you can see represented in the map, began settling the area vacated when these Roman troops withdrew. So Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. So the Jutes formed the Kingdom of Kent. The Saxons settled in these regions and then named them. So Wessex is from West Saxony, and Sussex from South Saxony, Essex from East Saxony. Angles formed kingdoms in Northumbria. So Northumbria just refers to north of the Humber River. And East Anglia comes from the Angles. We also, from the Angles, get the term England. And the Romans had troops in Britain and coexisted with the Celtic inhabitants, but they didn't leave a linguistic impression, right? So Latin didn't become an influence on linguistic development in England. However, the Anglo-Saxons did leave a lasting linguistic imprint on the island. So modern English is basically this combination of Old Anglo-Saxon, which became Old English, which is uh, this Germanic language, combined with French. And French brought over kind of a lot of the Latinate language. So combined with French, because at 1066 the Normans invaded, conquered the island and brought with them their Norman French to the language of the court. So I'll just quickly go over some of the features of these periods. So in this Anglo-Saxon literature, broadly 450 to 1066, it's oral heroic tales that are recited, caesuras, so there's a pause in the middle of the line, often a heavy use of alliteration, so repetition of consonant sounds. Use of what's called kennings. So these are compound words that metaphorically describe something. So, for example, a whale road for the sea. So very interesting literary techniques. That's very ancient literary techniques of these Germanic tribes. A tension between the Germanic warrior ethos and model of heroism that these tribes brought. And then they're later Christianized. So the ethos of Christianity kind of is in tension. You can see that tension in a lot of the literature. You can see on the right some of the major works, Beowulf being the key one. I won't go through the others. So 1066, as I mentioned, we have the Norman conquest, literature written predominantly in Anglo-Norman French by writers attached to the court. So this Anglo-Norman French is basically spoken only at the court. Rise of courtly romance and chivalric tales, religious historical writings, development of Arthurian legends at this time brought from the continent, influence of feudalism and church on literary themes. So you can see some examples on the right, the owl and the nightingale, I'll point out there. So Middle English. So when it comes to medieval literature, this is the high point, around 1200 to 1485. This is where we get Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which you've probably heard of, Langland, Piers Plowman, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by, it's an, we don't know the author, but Pearl Poet is often the name given to that person since the person also wrote a poem called The Pearl. We have a shift from Anglo-Norman French to Middle English as the literary language. Religious allegories and morality plays become popular, chivalric romances, and increased use of rhyme and meter in poetry. Renaissance, and here again the kind of the golden age, Renaissance literature, context being beginning in Italy, but then moving to Northern Europe, this revival of classical learning, a revival of study of Greek and Roman classics, and humanism. So going from, let's say, a medieval Christian worldview to one where the study of of human life in itself has a certain value. The other major influence, especially for English literature and other literatures in countries that went through this, is the influence of the Protestant Reformation. So English independence from Rome becomes a major theme, and you see this in Shakespeare's plays, actually. So Shakespeare has Rome in some ways. Uh, Figures, Cymbeline is an example, Rome as this kind of figure that needs to be uh, the monarch of England needs to gain independence from. Influence of the printing press in spreading literature, development of sonnet blank verse, and rebirth of true drama and tragedy. So Sir Thomas More's Utopia, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, The Fairy Queen by Spenser, Shakespeare, any work there, Hamlet, Milton, Paradise Lost, my favorite work of all time. And then the 1660, at the tail end of the Renaissance in England, there's a brief period where there's a civil war, and then for a brief period, England is a republic, they having deposed the monarchy. Then we have this restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660. So often, as a literary period, 1660 to the end of the 18th century are lumped together. The Restoration and 18th century is often it's often called as one period. We have in the 18th century a rise of prose fiction and the novel as a so the novel is a one genre. Okay, we're going to talk about genre, but is one form of work. So Shakespeare's works are plays, they're not novels. Novels are a very particular form of prose fiction that arose in the 18th century. So a fairly recent phenomena if you think about the thousands of years of literature. Um, Neoclassicism, this emphasis on reason, order, and decorum in response to the Enlightenment, political and philosophical writings, and the rise of satires, trying to say poke fun at, but also kind of insightful fun, like that we should be pushed to change our behavior about how we live and work as a society. So Jonathan Swift's very important there. Growth of periodicals and journalism for a broader reading public as more and more people learn how to read. So key works there, Swift, Gulliver's Travels, Robinson Crusoe by Defoe, an essay on man by Pope, and the novels by Richardson, Henry Fielding. So at the end of the 18th century, in the first half of the 19th century, there's this reaction against the kind of overemphasis on rational order and decorum that we had in the 18th century. So the 18th century, this era of enlightenment and neoclassicism had kind of emphasized this rational order and decorum and the rule of reason in human affairs. So these romantic poets, and it's not romantic in the sense of being focused on love, it's romantic in the sense of being focused on emotion and nature and individualism. Um, Gothic literature also emerges in this time, a rejection of industrialization. key authors there: Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley's Frankenstein, an example there, Lord Byron, Shelley, Keats, and a little bit of an overlap there with the periodization with Romanticism. Again, these are not sealed categories, but Victorian literature generally aligned with the rule of Victoria, Queen Victoria. We have an emphasis on realism and social critique, for instance, in the novels of Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy, an exploration of morality and class struggles. Poetry remains influential. Tennyson, Browning are examples. However, it's in this period that the novel becomes the dominant form. And the dominant form of the novel is serialized fiction. So they would come out in installments over time. Women writers gaining a prominence. So Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot. So George Eliot's Middlemarch, maybe my favorite novel of all time. Then modernist literature. I'll remind you, as I said, for almost all of these periods, I have in the description links to detailed introductions to these, as including modernist literature. So do check out my introduction to modernist literature. Here, at the beginning of the 20th century, we have reactions to this crisis of nihilism I mentioned. So we have experimentation in narrative structure and style. Joyce and Woolf are examples. So we can't tell our stories and create meanings in the old ways, right? So we have to change and experiment with artistic forms, a rejection of those older forms, themes of alienation, fragmentation, and existential crisis in this literature, influence of World War One and technological advancements. So key works there: James Joyce's Ulysses, Eliot's To the Wasteland, two powerhouse works, and both in 1922. Kafka, as an example, not English literature, but The Sound and the Fury, Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. Virginia Woolf, my favorite 20th century author. Just I do encourage you to check out that. I have lectures on that work as well as her Mrs. Dalloway. Then in the last half of the 20th century, we have what's often called postmodernist literature, so after modernism. And we have this emphasis on a playfulness with narrative and uh, in a style that's called metafiction. So basically, a fiction on fiction. So it's self-conscious and it's thinking about and talking about what narration does and stuff like that. So with that, you get kind of an irony, an ironic distance from the actual story that's being told, and a rejection of any grand narratives, they're called. So let's say a grand narrative around love or the importance of the family or the importance of friendship, whatever the narrative might be, or this notion of what is ultimately important. There's an ironic distance from it that makes for kind of a loss of anchor, let's say, for postmodernist literature. Some examples there: Flaubert's Parrot by Julian Barnes, another one of my favorites. Thomas Pynchon, Gravity's Rainbow, bit tougher, but I did really love his work, Crying of Lot 49.